Welcome to No Sleep Historian, the channel for restless minds and curious souls. If you can't sleep, you might as well learn something strange, from forgotten tragedies to bizarre events that slipped through the cracks of history. We explore the dark, weird, and unbelievable past that textbooks left behind. Grab a blanket, turn down the lights, and let the past keep you awake. The Anatomy of Agony, a History of Torture, Part 1. Torture is a mirror of civilization's darkest urges. It reveals the depth of our fears, the extremity of our laws, and the malleability of human morality under pressure. As long as there has been power to enforce and secrets to extract, there have been those willing to inflict pain in the pursuit of obedience, confession, and control. This story is not about isolated events or fringe punishments. It is about a long, unbroken thread of suffering that runs through history, a thread soaked in blood, bound by iron, and hidden in the shadows of courts, castles, temples, and prisons. The earliest evidence of institutional torture dates back thousands of years, embedded in the foundations of civilization itself. In ancient Mesopotamia, justice systems were codified in clay, and harsh physical punishments were described in detail. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal documents, did not shy away from brutality. If a man accused another man and could not prove his claim, he was sentenced to death. If a builder's house collapsed and killed the owner's son, the builder's son would be executed. This principle of retaliatory justice was rigid and unforgiving. While not explicitly detailing torture for interrogation, the framework opened the door to discretionary punishment, where pain was often the currency of truth and justice. In ancient Egypt, the pharaohs ruled as living gods, and their power extended into the afterlife. Maintaining social order required more than just laws. It required fear. Slaves, criminals, and enemies of the state were frequently subjected to physical punishment. Hieroglyphics and tomb art rarely depict torture outright, but records such as the judicial papyrus of Turin revealed procedures that included beatings and mutilation. Accused conspirators were often interrogated through pain to reveal accomplices. In one notable incident during the reign of Ramses III, members of his harem plotted to assassinate him. When the conspiracy was uncovered, suspects were tortured and forced to testify against each other before being executed or mutilated. The Egyptian system may have hidden its cruelty beneath religious and judicial pomp, but its methods were direct and devastating. Ancient Greece offers a paradox. It was the birthplace of democracy and philosophy, yet it maintained a firm belief that certain people could be tortured as a matter of course. Under Athenian law, free citizens could not legally be tortured for testimony, but slaves could. In fact, testimony from a slave was only considered valid if obtained under duress, preferably through physical torture. This reflected a deeply ingrained belief in the reliability of pain to uncover truth, and a willingness to ignore the ethics of suffering when applied to those considered socially inferior. Devices used included whips, branding irons, and instruments that left little doubt as to their purpose. Philosophers like Aristotle and Plato questioned the reliability of confessions under torture, but their ethical musings did little to change practice. Truth, it seemed, could be beaten out of the unwilling, or at least enough of a version of it to satisfy a courtroom. The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur and architectural legacy, was also a brutal machine of conquest and control. Torture was not just a legal tool, it was entertainment, deterrent, and spectacle. Crucifixion, perhaps the most infamous of Roman punishments, was not just an execution method, but a prolonged torture designed to humiliate and terrorize. Victims could linger for days on the cross, exposed to the elements, their joints dislocated, their lungs slowly collapsing. Gladiatorial games routinely showcased brutal deaths, but Roman torture extended far beyond the arena. Interrogations often involved the strappado, suspending victims by their wrists tied behind their backs, and the application of heated metal rods, flaying knives, or wooden racks. Roman law, especially under emperors like Nero and Caligula, permitted torture as both punishment and entertainment. Enslaved people were particularly vulnerable. Their testimony was considered unreliable unless extracted under torture. The Roman Senate even codified procedures for how to torture slaves during legal proceedings. Torture was not the tool of a desperate state. It was the instrument of a confident one, used to maintain order, exert dominance, and suppress dissent. As the empire transitioned into Christianity, torture did not vanish. It was recontextualized. Early Christians were often its victims, martyred in colosseums or executed in grisly public spectacles. But in time, as Christianity became the dominant religion and melded with imperial authority, it would become the hand that wielded the whip, not just the body that received it. In the East, similar dynamics played out with regional differences. Ancient China's legal tradition was among the most sophisticated in the world, yet it featured a well-documented and widespread use of torture. Confucian ideals emphasized order and hierarchy, and while they theoretically promoted moral governance, they were often enforced with an iron hand. Dynastic law codes allowed torture for interrogations, especially in cases of treason, murder, or bribery. Instruments included the bastinado, beating the soles of the feet, and finger crushers. The judicial system even developed a graded scale of punishments to extract confessions, escalating from mild to severe, depending on the response of the accused. Chinese officials were trained in the application of judicial torture and were expected to follow procedural guidelines, but the rules often did little to curb excesses. Many confessions were obtained simply because the alternative silence was unbearable. Public displays of punishment were also common, reinforcing the power of the state. While the goal was to maintain societal harmony, the means to that end were anything but harmonious. In India, the practice of torture can be traced back to ancient times, particularly during the Mauryan Empire. Arthashastra, a political treatise attributed to the strategist Chanukya, outlined methods of governance that included physical coercion. Suspected criminals and enemies of the state were interrogated through burning, beating, or starvation. These techniques were not hidden in shadows. They were enshrined in political philosophy. The goal was stability through control, and torture was part of that formula. Among the most methodical torturers in history were the Assyrians. Their empire, centered in what is now Iraq, was infamous for its cruelty in warfare and statecraft. Assyrian records, written in cuneiform on stone tablets, boast of flaying enemies alive, impaling captives on stakes, and dismembering dissenters. These were not war crimes committed in desperation. They were deliberate strategies of terror designed to break resistance before it formed. The Assyrians understood the psychological power of public torture. They used it to paralyze populations with fear and ensure total submission. Mesoamerican civilizations had their own traditions. The Aztecs, for instance, performed human sacrifices as religious rituals, while not torture in the judicial sense. These sacrifices involved prolonged rituals that could include skinning, dismemberment, or being burned alive. Victims were often war captives, chosen for their strength and symbolic value. The pain inflicted was not just punishment, it was a form of communication with the gods, a transaction of blood for favor. In pre-Islamic Arabia, tribal justice often involved mutilation or revenge-based torture. With the rise of Islam, however, many of these practices were formally outlawed or severely limited under Sharia law. While interpretations varied across regions and centuries, Islamic jurisprudence generally emphasized proportionate justice and humane treatment. Nevertheless, in practice, regimes throughout the Islamic world occasionally reverted to coercive tactics, especially during periods of instability or heresy. The pattern across these early civilizations is disturbingly consistent. Torture was rarely viewed as aberrant. It was a normalized component of legal, political, and religious systems. The specific instruments and rituals varied, but the logic remained the same. Pain could compel truth, suppress rebellion, enforce loyalty, and sanctify rule. There was little concern for the psychological or moral damage. Suffering was not just collateral, it was the point. By the time Europe entered the Middle Ages, this ethos had not diminished. If anything, it had matured into something colder, more bureaucratic, and far more refined. The Anatomy of Agony, a History of Torture, Part 2. As Europe transitioned into the Middle Ages, the collapse of centralized Roman authority gave rise to feudal kingdoms, fractured legal systems, and a deep intertwining of religious and secular power. Torture, far from disappearing, became institutionalized in new, often more insidious ways. It was no longer just the tool of an emperor or warlord. Now it was wielded by the church, the state, and local lords alike, sometimes separately, often together, in a systematic effort to extract confessions, punish heresy, and enforce social hierarchy. By the 12th century, Europe witnessed a resurgence of Roman legal principles, particularly through the rediscovery of Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis. This revitalized legal interest did not bring about mercy. Instead, it helped codify and standardize torture procedures. Around this time, the medieval Inquisition took form. Though widely misunderstood today, its historical function was brutally clear: to root out and eliminate heresy through religious trials, and torture played a central role. The first papal authorization of torture for inquisitorial purposes came in 1252 under Pope Innocent IV through the papal bull Ad Extirpanda. This decree allowed the use of torture to extract confessions from accused heretics, though it technically forbade the loss of life or limb. In practice, these restrictions were largely ignored. The Inquisition gave birth to some of the most infamous devices and techniques of historical torture, many specifically designed to leave no visible marks. One such device was the strappado. The accused would have their arms tied behind their back and be suspended by a rope attached to their wrists. Victims were dropped and caught abruptly, wrenching their shoulders out of their sockets and causing excruciating internal damage. It was often repeated multiple times in succession. This was considered a moderate technique. No blood, no obvious mutilation, just irreversible agony. Then there was the rack, a long wooden frame with rollers at each end. The victim's wrists and ankles were bound to the rollers, which were slowly turned, gradually stretching the body. Muscles tore, ligaments snapped, and joints dislocated. In extreme cases, the victim's body could be stretched by over a foot, resulting in permanent paralysis or death. The creaking of the rack, became synonymous with medieval cruelty, yet for centuries it was regarded as a legitimate instrument of law. Another common method was pressing, or peine forte et dure. Weights were placed on the victim's chest, increasing incrementally until the individual either confessed or died. Bones broke, lungs collapsed, and organs failed under the pressure. Pressing was particularly popular in England and its colonies, sometimes used against defendants who refused to enter a plea, thus avoiding a formal trial. Thumbscrews were also widely used, small vices designed to crush fingers or toes. Their purpose was not to kill, but to cause so much pain that the victim would say anything to make it stop. Often the devices would be heated before use, or modified with jagged teeth to break skin and bone more quickly. Water torture was another recurring technique. Variations existed across regions and centuries. The water cure involved forcing large quantities of water down the victim's throat, often while the nose was plugged, inducing a drowning sensation. Sometimes cloth would be used to stuff the mouth and nose simultaneously, adding suffocation to the list of horrors. This method, later mimicked in modern times as waterboarding, was a favorite during inquisitions, due to its psychological devastation and the absence of physical evidence. One of the more creative and grotesque tools was the pear of anguish, shaped like a flower bud with metal petals that expanded outward when a screw was turned. It was inserted into the mouth, anus, or vagina. Once in place, the petals would be gradually forced open, tearing soft tissues and causing irreversible internal damage. It was a method of torture that combined humiliation with agony, often reserved for those accused of blasphemy, sodomy, or witchcraft. Speaking of witchcraft, no discussion of medieval torture would be complete without examining the witch hunts of the 15th to 17th centuries. These were not spontaneous acts of mass hysteria, but state-sanctioned campaigns of terror, often fueled by religious leaders and local authorities. Torture played a central role in extracting confessions from accused witches, many of whom were women, marginalized individuals, or simply unlucky enough to fall under suspicion. The Malleus Maleficarum, published in 1487 by Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, became the handbook for witch hunters. It explicitly endorsed torture, claiming that the devil granted witches strength to endure pain unless it was prolonged and repeated. As a result, victims were subjected to sustained and escalating torture over several days. Common techniques included sleep deprivation, crushing, scalding, and flaying. Confessions were often absurd. Women admitted to flying, copulating with demons, or cursing livestock, but these statements were accepted as divine truth under the law. It's important to note that many torturers believed they were saving souls. The goal wasn't just punishment, but repentance. The agony inflicted was seen as cleansing, a path to confession that would allow the heretic or witch to be redeemed before death. This twisted theological justification enabled widespread cruelty under the guise of salvation. Not all medieval torture was performed in dungeons. Public torture and execution were essential parts of the legal landscape. They served as warnings to the masses, performed in town squares with large crowds. Hanging, drawing, and quartering was the most infamous of these. Reserved for those convicted of treason, it involved hanging the victim until near death, disemboweling them while still alive, and then beheading and dismembering the body. The parts were displayed as warnings to others. This punishment was practiced in England well into the 18th century. In France, the breaking wheel was popular. The condemned would be strapped to a large wooden wheel and their limbs systematically smashed with a sledgehammer. Sometimes the wheel was turned between strikes to prolong suffering. Victims were then left on display until they died from their wounds or exposure. Burning at the stake was used across Europe, often for heretics or witches. It was not a quick death. Depending on the fuel and wind, it could take several minutes or longer for the victim to succumb. In some cases, gunpowder was tied around the neck to hasten the end, but this was not always afforded. The Iron Maiden, often cited as a symbol of medieval cruelty, is likely a myth. While there are accounts of spiked coffins, the elaborate Iron Maidens we see in museums today are mostly 18th or 19th century fabrications. However, the symbolic appeal of the Iron Maiden speaks volumes about how torture has been remembered or imagined in the collective memory. The medieval period perfected torture as both a public theater and private science. Legal systems supported it, religious doctrines justified it, and the populace, more often than not, accepted it. For centuries, torture was not viewed as a last resort. It was a legitimate and common path to truth and punishment. But just as torture reached its zenith in visibility and brutality, the tides of thought began to shift. The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, and a growing body of legal and philosophical critique would soon challenge the very foundations of institutional cruelty. Torture Through Time, The Dark Legacy of Human Ingenuity, Part 3. The instruments of torture were not always limited to physical mutilation or death. Psychological torment emerged as a cruel and often more effective weapon. Inquisition tribunals perfected the art of prolonged anticipation. Victims were often shown the instruments of torture and given time to mentally unravel before any physical harm was done. The mere idea of what awaited them was sometimes enough to extract confessions. Sleep deprivation, isolation, and the manipulation of time were powerful tools. In medieval and early modern Europe, prisoners in dungeons were kept in complete darkness, fed irregularly, and denied any sense of time. They became disoriented, hallucinated, and sometimes confessed simply to end the torment. This manipulation of perception blurred the line between madness and truth. The Chinese practiced psychological torment as well, often utilizing methods of slow mental erosion, public humiliation, forced confessions under duress, and the degradation of one's status or identity could be as effective as physical mutilation. Families were used against the accused, and shame was wielded like a weapon. While Confucian ideals promoted order and morality, the state maintained these virtues through deeply invasive controls. During the height of the transatlantic slave trade, psychological torture was paired with physical brutality to ensure submission. On slave ships, captives were kept in total darkness, chained tightly, and subjected to a regimen of confusion and punishment. In the Americas, rebellion was suppressed with ritualistic punishment, from mutilation to being forced to watch the suffering of family members. The destruction of identity, name, and culture was deliberate and enduring torture. The Age of Enlightenment brought with it a growing discomfort with torture, but it didn't immediately disappear. Some Enlightenment thinkers spoke out against it. Cesare Beccaria, for instance, argued for proportionate punishment and against torture, but many nations continued to employ it behind closed doors. The public execution and spectacle began to wane, replaced by systemic, often hidden, forms of suffering. One of the most notorious psychological torture methods emerged from the 20th century: solitary confinement. While it appears less violent, its effects are profound. Prolonged isolation leads to anxiety, hallucinations, memory loss, and suicidal ideation. Used extensively in prisons across the world, it has become a modern method of mental dismantling. In World War II, both Axis and Allied powers employed psychological and physical torture in various degrees. The Gestapo used beatings, starvation, and threats against families to extract information. In Japan, the Kempeitai military police tortured prisoners with water torture, electric shocks, and forced exposure to extreme weather. The aim wasn't just punishment, but the breaking of spirit. In the Soviet Union, the NKVD perfected the art of the midnight knock arrests conducted without warning, followed by days or weeks of interrogations using stress positions, threats, and starvation. Torture became a political tool, a means to erase enemies, rewrite narratives, and maintain power. The United States, despite constitutional protections, has not remained untouched by the legacy of torture. From the use of third-degree interrogation in early 20th century policing to more recent controversies involving enhanced interrogation techniques during the War on Terror, the line between interrogation and torture has remained uncomfortably vague. Waterboarding, stress positions, sensory deprivation, and psychological manipulation were all techniques justified as necessary for national security. Though widely condemned internationally, their use sparked heated debate on morality, legality, and efficacy. In Latin America, during the Cold War, especially under regimes in Chile and Argentina, torture was state-sanctioned. The victims, often political dissidents, were electrocuted, raped, beaten, and drugged. The goal wasn't just to extract information, it was to erase dissent through fear. Victims disappeared by the tens of thousands, leaving behind terrified populations and generations scarred by silence. Africa, too, has seen its share of torture techniques evolve through colonization and post-independence regimes. Under colonial rule, torture was often used to suppress resistance, as seen in Kenya during the Momo uprising. Later, dictators such as Idi Amin of Uganda institutionalized torture chambers, using them to consolidate power. Electric torture, genital mutilation, and mass executions were routine. Religious torture also did not die with the Inquisition. In modern cults and extremist groups, torture has been used to control followers. Psychological control, starvation, forced confessions, and ritual punishments are all aspects of cult life, especially when leaders claim divine authority. These microcosms of power mirror the cruelty of larger regimes. Sexual torture, a particularly heinous method, has existed throughout history and continues today. In war, sexual violence is used to humiliate and destroy. Women are targeted disproportionately, though men have also been victims. During the Bosnian War in the 1990s, rape camps were created. In Rwanda, sexual violence was a tool of genocide. The use of sexual torture is designed not only to hurt the body, but to destroy identity, family structure, and community. Technology has added new dimensions to torture. Surveillance, data manipulation, and cyberbullying are emerging forms of psychological control. Victims may be harassed online, have their information leaked, or face virtual mob justice. While these may not fit traditional definitions of torture, the effects can be devastating. Reputational destruction, social ostracization, and induced paranoia are real consequences. In authoritarian regimes today, torture is still used as a means to suppress protest and maintain order. From North Korea to Syria, reports of torture remain frequent. Devices haven't changed much: whips, electric batons, and water torture, but the intent is the same: control through fear. International laws, like the United Nations Convention Against Torture, have attempted to curtail the use of such practices, but enforcement is inconsistent. Nations often deny the existence of torture or justify it as necessary. Secrecy is maintained through tight media control, intimidation, and the destruction of evidence. Perhaps one of the darkest aspects of torture's history is how easily it can be rationalized. For religion, for order, for security, for revenge. It hides in policy, lurks in secrecy, and flourishes in fear. The tools evolve, but the intent remains: to dominate, to silence, to control. The legacy of torture is not just about the devices or the pain. It's about the enduring capacity for cruelty within systems of power. It raises hard questions about justice, humanity, and the cost of control. As we explore its history, we're not just looking at past horrors, we're examining the mechanisms of power that continue to shape our world today. Part 4: Renaissance Refinement and Enlightened Cruelty. The Renaissance is often remembered as a period of remarkable artistic and scientific innovation. Yet, beneath the surface of intellectual awakening, brutality found new expression. Torture, in many cases, was refined to become more sophisticated, more efficient, not only in physical suffering, but also in psychological torment. The iron chair, in parts of Europe, notably France, Germany, and Italy, one of the most psychologically horrifying torture devices, came into popularity. The iron chair, contrary to what its name might suggest, this wasn't a chair for passive containment. It was a metal throne, often embedded with hundreds of spikes across its seat, back, arms, and leg rests. The victim was forced to sit in the chair, sometimes for hours or even days, while the spikes pierced into their skin. Contrary to what might be expected, the spikes were usually not designed to be fatal. Executioners took care to avoid puncturing major arteries or organs, as the goal was prolonged pain and intimidation. The victim would be tightly strapped down to prevent movement. Sometimes, a fire would be lit beneath the chair, slowly heating the metal and cooking the victim alive while they remained impaled. The psychological dread of the iron chair, combined with its visibility in town squares, made it an effective instrument of both torture and deterrence. Scavenger's daughter. During the reign of King Henry VIII, England introduced a rather compact but brutal device, the scavenger's daughter. This metal contraption folded the victim's body into a tortuously tight position, is forced into the chest. Head shoved forward, arms pulled inward and downward. Unlike devices that inflicted lacerations or blunt trauma, the scavenger's daughter was designed to cause internal rupture. Blood would ooze from the nose and ears as the body was compressed, organs pressed to the point of hemorrhaging. It was considered the inverse of the rack. Whereas the rack stretched, the daughter compressed. Its efficiency and grotesque nature made it ideal for extracting confessions quickly. One could not withstand the scavenger's daughter for long without breaking, either physically or mentally. Its relative portability meant it could be employed inside castle walls or underground prisons, giving it an aura of secret terror. Psychological torture in the early modern period. As legal systems became more codified during the 16th and 17th centuries, many states turned to psychological methods of torture. Sensory deprivation became a common technique. Prisoners were isolated in pitch-black cells for weeks, even months. Food would be irregular. Time would be warped. Victims reported hallucinations, disassociation, and a rapid collapse of mental stability. Other forms of psychological manipulation included mock executions. A prisoner might be led to the gallows or the headsman's block, blindfolded and prepared for death, only to be granted a sudden, dramatic reprieve. The emotional whiplash from these staged events could unravel even the most resolute minds. Witch trials and torture in early modern Europe. Witch hunts offered fertile ground for some of the most extreme abuses of torture in early modern history. Between the late 1400s and the 1700s, tens of thousands of individuals, mostly women, were accused of witchcraft, especially in regions like Germany, Scotland, and Switzerland. Torture devices previously mentioned were employed frequently, but new additions appeared as well. The thumbscrew, a compact device, crushed fingers or toes by gradually turning a vise. This method was commonly used during interrogations. Inquisitors also used strapetto, where the accused was hoisted by ropes tied to their arms and then dropped suddenly, dislocating shoulders. Combined with sleep deprivation and starvation, these methods led many to confess to impossible crimes. The heretic's fork, used by both religious and secular authorities. Particularly during the Inquisition, the heretic's fork was a metal rod with prongs on both ends. One end was positioned under the chin, the other against the chest or sternum. It didn't pierce the skin, but it prevented any movement of the head. Speaking, nodding, or lowering the head would result in stabbing pain. Victims were often left like this for days, forced into silence and hyper-alertness. Sleep was impossible. Eventually, the body would collapse under fatigue, driving the forks into the skin or shattering nerves. This was not just a torture of the body, it was a torment of the will. The pear of anguish, shaped like a metal flower bud. The pear of anguish was inserted into a victim's mouth, rectum, or vagina. Once in place, the device was slowly cranked open. Metal petals expanded outward, tearing flesh from within. It was used primarily against women accused of witchcraft or adultery, and homosexuals in some jurisdictions. While death from the device was rare, infections were common, and psychological scars ran deep. Even the threat of this instrument was enough to secure immediate compliance or false confessions. The cruelty was in the intimacy of the attack, defiled, humiliated, and destroyed dignity. The brazen bull, a Renaissance revival. Though originally used in ancient Greece, the brazen bull saw renewed fascination during the Renaissance as stories of ancient punishment were rediscovered. Some Renaissance courts built replicas, including the Spanish and some northern Italian city-states. Victims were locked inside a hollow bronze statue shaped like a bull. A fire was lit underneath. As the victim roasted alive, their screams were channeled through tubes in the bull's head, modified to resemble an animal's bellowing. It was, at once, theatrical and horrifying, a public display meant to communicate absolute power. Despite the Renaissance's emphasis on reason, the methods of control remained rooted in primal domination. This contradiction between Enlightenment and barbarity defined the use of torture in the period. Part 5. Industrial Age to Modern Day. From pain to perception. The Industrial Age brought machines, steam power, and modern factories, but it did not eliminate humanity's appetite for control through suffering. Instead, torture evolved with the times. Techniques became less public, more clinical, and in the modern era, the focus shifted from spectacle to secrecy. The rack revisited. Industrial torture machines. In the 19th century, many forms of mechanical torture re-emerged, inspired by the gears and pulleys of the Industrial Revolution. Some prisons and asylums were rumored to have modern versions of the rack, with enhanced torque from iron cranks. While largely hidden from the public, accounts leaked from political prisoners in Europe and the Americas. Devices resembling large-scale vices or rotating tables were allegedly used to break limbs or dislocate joints. Unlike medieval torture, these weren't for public viewing. They were tools of state repression used behind closed doors. Colonial atrocities. European colonial empires carried with them not only weapons and flags, but also methods of control rooted in torture. In the Congo Free State, under the rule of King Leopold II of Belgium, atrocities were committed on a scale rarely acknowledged in modern history. Entire villages were punished for failure to meet rubber quotas. Whipping with the chikada, a hippohide whip, was common. Victims were often flogged until their muscles were exposed or their internal organs ruptured. In British-controlled India, as well as in parts of the Caribbean and Africa, rebels or dissenters were subjected to various brutalities. These included hot irons, mutilation, and extended forms of public humiliation. Torture in colonies served to dehumanize and exert dominance over subjected peoples. Torture in the World Wars. During the 20th century's two world wars, torture was both condemned and widely practiced. In World War I, trench warfare created new psychological tortures: shell shock, gas exposure, and prolonged sensory bombardment. While not torture in the legal sense, the war environment inflicted irreversible trauma. World War II, however, saw formalized torture. Nazi Germany employed horrifying methods in concentration camps: forced standing, sleep deprivation, ice baths, beatings, and gruesome medical experiments. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese military tortured prisoners with waterboarding, amputations, and starvation. Post-war tribunals would document these atrocities in detail, yet some techniques survived into the Cold War era. The Cold War and psychological torture. The Cold War introduced a new era of covert psychological torture. The United States and the Soviet Union both conducted experiments to understand and control the human mind. Projects like M-Cultra explored the use of LSD, sensory deprivation tanks, and hypnosis to extract information or manipulate behavior. In the Eastern Bloc, dissidents were tortured in prisons with techniques that left no marks: sleep deprivation, endless interrogation, isolation, and manipulation of light and temperature. Psychological torture became a focus of intelligence agencies as the goal shifted from physical destruction to psychological breakdown. It became more difficult to detect and even harder to prove. Modern torture and human rights. In recent decades, revelations of torture have sparked international outrage. The Abu Ghraib prison scandal in Iraq showed American military personnel using humiliating and abusive techniques on detainees. Guantanamo Bay became infamous for practices like waterboarding simulated drowning, which was reclassified as torture by many human rights organizations. Other nations, including Syria, North Korea, and Iran, continue to use torture as a method of political repression. Even in democratic societies, questions linger about the ethics of enhanced interrogation. International conventions like the UN Convention Against Torture attempt to regulate and ban such practices, yet enforcement remains inconsistent. Torture in pop culture. Modern media has turned torture into a spectacle once again, but now it's fictionalized. Movies, video games, and TV shows feature brutal scenes meant to shock and entertain. This normalization of torture in entertainment has sparked debates about desensitization. It raises a chilling question. When suffering becomes background noise, how do we recognize real cruelty, legacy, and reflection? The history of torture is a mirror held up to human society, reflecting both our capacity for cruelty and our struggle for justice. From the dungeons of medieval Europe to the black sites of the 21st century, torture has evolved but never disappeared. The fight against it continues, driven by whistleblowers, journalists, and human rights advocates. Remembering its history is not an act of morbid curiosity, it is a safeguard. For as long as torture is forgotten, it can be repeated. This concludes our unflinching look at the tools of torment used through the ages. If history teaches us anything, it is that cruelty often hides in plain sight, draped in the language of justice, security, and righteousness. Thanks for watching No Sleep Historian, where the past never rests. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the bell so you never miss a midnight revelation.